Attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning and welcome to AMSSA's webinar titled Dynamic Workshops, the Fundamentals of Curriculum Development. My name is Sabrina Ziegler and I am AMSSA's Sectoral Communications Coordinator, and I will be guiding us through today's webinar. I'm accompanied here at AMSSA by Bahar Taheri, AMSSA Sectoral Communications Coordinator, who will be supporting me today. We would like to thank Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada for funding this event today. Currently, you can see Carol Stretch, who is our presenter in the webcam, and she will be introducing herself shortly after a few items of housekeeping. So before we begin the webinar, I would like to go through a couple areas of housekeeping. On the right-hand side of the GoToWebinar panel, you will find a control panel that can be expanded and collapsed by clicking on the arrow. And it is also possible to expand the features within that control panel by clicking on the plus sign symbol next to the title. In the audio tab, you will have two options to listen to the webinar today. One is through microphone and speakers through your computer, and the other one is via the telephone. Please note that long-distance charges may apply if you connect to the audio through the telephone. There will be a question and answer period at the end of the webinar today, and please send us your questions at any time during the webinar using the Q&A box, or email us your questions to events@amssa.org. For any technical difficulties, you may contact my colleague Melissa J at events@amssa.org, or you can call her at 604-718-4220. 604-718-4221, and she will be more than happy to help you. Also, in the handout that was sent out with today's webinar, there is a tech FAQ at the back of that handout, so that may be able to assist you in troubleshooting any technical difficulties you experience. Today's webinar will be recorded and posted on our AMSSA website, along with any resources provided throughout the session today. We will send a notification on SetNet when they are posted. If you do not receive the weekly SetNet updates, please log on to our website and sign up. It's free to everyone to join. For more information on SetNet, please check your handout where there's a little bit of information about that in there. The AMSSA team will be live tweeting today's event. Join in the conversation online and follow the event using the hashtag AMSSA events. AMSSA's Twitter handle is @AMSSABC. Please feel free to submit your questions, participate in the discussion, connect with other webinar participants. If you're watching in a group today, tweet us your photo of you watching the webinar today, all using the hashtag AMSSA events. So now I'm going to hand it over to our presenter, Carol Stretch, who will be guiding us through the content of today's webinar.
Thank you, Sabrina. You can see me in the box here. As you say, my name is Carol Stretch. My background is as an ESL teacher in a number of countries, and I have developed curriculum both in Norway and Canada. But for the last 8 years, I've been working up in Whistler and Pemberton, firstly with the ESL program, Welcoming Communities, and now I'm Program Manager for Settlement Services Delivery in Whistler and Pemberton, working for Capilano University. So over the last 2 to 3 years, I've been managing the transition from provincial to federal funding and introducing settlement services into our communities that are obviously rural communities. I'm going to leave my photo on the side for a while, but it is snowing, and sometimes when it snows it gets a bit flaky, so if I disappear, that's the reason why. And so thank you, Sabrina and AMSSA, for the opportunity to do this. The outline. Okay, there's a little delay. I will continue. So the outline of what I'm hoping to go through today is just really to talk about some key concepts about curriculum and to kind of demystify really what it is and how it works and how we plan a curriculum, and then to have a look at how that applies to the settlement context, and particularly to the IRCC environment, and look at adult learners and our adult settlement clients. And then before I hand over to Lisa Herrera, who is going to talk through a case study, I'm just going to take a little bit of time to suggest a framework or some ways that you can work to develop curriculum locally for settlement services. So I think when people talk about curriculum, they hear a number of words, and they hear syllabus and they hear curriculum. And just to clarify, syllabus is just literally the content or the subject matter. It's just a list of content. Curriculum is a much larger thing, and so it's a plan, and it covers you know, what we're trying to achieve, what are our objectives, so it sets down those, what is the content, what is it that we're going to teach, how will it be taught, when and in what order will it be taught, and then how much detail are we actually going to teach. And so you can see that it takes just a listing of the content and makes it much more clear to the instructor for sure, but also to the learners. So it really starts matching that syllabus and the content and the aims to the needs of the learners, and to the content, what are we going to actually teach them and how. Before going through the process, I just wanted to talk quickly about approach to curriculum design. And so this can be really technical, but there are a number of approaches, and there may be 3 or 4. Each one is appropriate to a different situation and to a different environment. But I wanted to take a little bit of time to just look at 2. And if you look at them, you'll probably feel that you know these, they're familiar. On the left is what's called a subject-centered approach to curriculum. And really the key to that is that it's that picture of the instructor standing at the front of the class talking, the class is listening, the students work alone, they do activities, we evaluate, and it's really just about information transfer. On the right-hand side, you've got some information about the learner-centered approach, which is much more focused on the needs, the abilities of the learners, what the learners want. It really is based on what the learner's knowledge, skills and experiences are, what the learner wants, and it's more focused on changing attitudes, skills and behaviours. And in this model, we don't have the instructor standing at the front of the room. We have the students interacting with the instructor. They're working with each other. The students can work in pairs or groups. And so it's a much more interactive classroom. It's much more noisy. And the students have much more input into the whole experience. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, when we talk about adult learners and some of their expectations when they come to you. So the curriculum development process sits within those high-level aims. So there would be typically a high-level decision as to what the outcomes would be and what the topics would be. And then once we have those, we're going to go through a process of, first of all, identifying needs, formulating objectives, and then selecting content as a result of that. Once we have the content, we're going to organize it. We're going to then organize our learning experiences. And the final bit in the loop is to decide what and how to evaluate, which then allows us to go around the loop again and improve the curriculum and the learning experiences. So I just wanted to go through quickly each bit of that process, starting with the aims, goals, and objectives. So typically those high-level aims are external to the instructor, to the person on the ground who's going to be delivering. They tend to be fairly general. They represent what the learning outcomes, what we want the students to be able to do and what the changes in their behavior will be after that learning experience. And those generally form the framework for assessing how well we've done in the curriculum, how well we've achieved those objectives. Once you start getting down to your goals and objectives, you're going to be more specific and look at really three types of learning. What knowledge, so at the end of the learning experience, what knowledge will the learner have? But also we're going to look at how their behaviors, what skills, what will the learner be able to do at the end of this learning experience? And that learning experience can be one workshop or a series of workshops. All of this applies to both of those situations. And then also we can look at attitudes. How will the learner view things after this experience? How will they approach things? And so I thought what I would try to do is give you an example. And this is something we do quite a lot of in Whistler and Pemberton. Financial literacy is something that's important, especially at this time of year. And so this would be an example of a high-level aim, which comes from IRCC. So newcomers are contributing to the economic, social, and cultural life of the community. So we know that we have that overall aim. That's the desired learning outcome. So further down from IRCC, I've adapted this. Learners will have knowledge of, and I've put in financial rights and responsibilities in Canada, and make informed decisions about and act on their financial responsibilities in Canadian society. So now I'm getting further towards a real objective for whether it's one workshop or a series of workshops. And so I've picked here the income tax system. It's timely at the moment. And so the objectives, I've taken objectives, established one for knowledge, one for skills and attitudes. So by the end of this learning experience, learners will understand the concept and basics of the Canadian income tax system. So that would be knowledge. They're going to know what it is and how it works. What skill will they have? They'll be able to complete and file their tax return. And their attitudes, they'll understand. They'll understand that they need to complete and return their annual tax return as required, and they will be doing it. So that would be then the basis for me to continue now to develop curriculum for that particular set of aims, goals, and objectives. So going back to that process, the first thing that we're going to do is assess needs. And there are a number of needs that we're going to look at. And this is where local knowledge is absolutely key. You're going to look at who are your target clients, who are the people who are actually going to walk through the door. And that's going to be very different depending on the community and the clients that you're serving. So for example, in Whistler, we have many, I would say our big groups are Japanese, Filipino and Spanish speaking from South America. You go 50 kilometers down the road to Squamish and there's a huge Punjabi community with very, very different needs, very, very different profile. So this is where the knowledge of the settlement worker really starts playing into curriculum development. So in terms of tax, for example, what your clients need, what's their situation, do they have children, are they married, are they single, are they running small businesses, do they have employees, are they working more than one job? All of those are things that you might want to think about in terms of assessing what needs they have in terms of tax information that they're going to need. What gaps then do your clients have? Do they understand what their tax responsibilities and rates are? Do they understand what to expect from an employer? Can they actually complete and file a tax return? And then, of course, you're going to think about what are your clients asking for? When you're working with clients, you're going to have questions. So that's going to give you a need. It's going to give you their subjective need. What questions have you had? But at the same time, how many people have asked? So is it a big need? Is it not so big? Something to think about when you're assessing needs. And then, of course, many immigrants don't know what the questions are. They don't know what knowledge or skills that they lack. And so as a settlement worker, you're going to think about, I know that there is this core Canadian knowledge. There are certain things that they need to know to be able to function well. So that needs to be put into the picture as well. And then one last thing to think about when you're assessing needs is what are the types of learning that your clients respond to best? What is their learning and educational background? We're going to come back to this later. Do they need to develop a more self-sufficient approach to learning? Are there communicative skills? Are there essential skills that could be bound into the learning experience, regardless of what the topic of any workshop or series is? So those needs, those learning needs, are something else to put into the needs assessment process. And I think probably most people do this naturally as they go along. As you're thinking about your clients, you're aware of what their needs are, what their lacks are. So having really, I think it's just useful to put it down on paper to formalize it. Having done that, you're going to look at selecting content. And so, you know, you can end up with a long list of things that could be included in any topic, in any workshop. So you're going to use, first of all, the needs assessment to filter that, but then also there are some other things to think about. There may be social needs, there may be things that the clients and the learners, there are gaps between them and the needs of Canadian society. It may be that some things are going to be more important for your clients to achieving those overall objectives. So you're going to think about which things are the bigger priorities, which are the lesser priorities. What's of most use to the client? And that's a big one, because adult learners, one of the big things for adult learners is I want it to be useful, I want it to be relevant to me, I need it to be something that I can use. And interest, again, is something that's, I think, is fairly big. Interest, you actually need to get them to come through the door. And so this is a balance between their subjective needs and interests and your objective assessment. What is it that they need to do? So interest, deciding what it is, what's going to engage them, is a big part of selecting content. Any content that you select, we need to make sure it's up to date. You know, how do we do that? And timing can be relevant here. The timing that you choose for a workshop. If you know that some changes are coming up, you might want to time it after that. So just make sure that everything is up to date. And then we come to how easy is this content to learn for your clients. When you're selecting content, you want to make sure it's not too hard, not too easy. If it's too hard, they'll just struggle. And if it's too easy, I think most adults would feel that they weren't being challenged enough or they weren't getting what they want. So another thing to think about when selecting content. And then just make sure there's a good balance between facts, knowledge. Adults like to get knowledge, but also I think a lot of what we're doing is trying to pass on concepts and ideas. So getting a good balance between facts and concepts. So where are you going to get this content from? Where are you going to identify it? Are there sources, are there internal sources to your agency? Or are you going to go outside? Are you going to ask a speaker to come in? Regardless of whether it's internal or external, thinking about the needs of your clients, you're going to think about adapting it, tailoring the content if you've gone through a needs assessment for a particular group, then that adaptation and tailoring is going to be a standard part of delivering any content. And so finally, you're going to come up with a list of what knowledge, skills, and values should be included, how much detail is going to be included, to what depth. And a large driver of that, of course, is going to be how much time do you have available. Is this a 1-hour workshop, or is it a series of workshops? And all of these are going to interplay to help you select that content. Once you've selected your content, then we need to decide how we're going to organize it, and that really means what order are we going to present that in. And so the sequence is something else to think about. And there are many, many ways to sequence it. There's no answer to sequencing it, but you can think about some of these ideas. So you can start with the simplest idea, moving to most complex so that they build. If it's something that can be seen as a step-by-step process, you could think about doing it chronologically. I mean, even a tax return could be taken that way. What is it that you do first? Collect your documents, know this. So that's another way to look at it. You could start with more concrete, kind of factual content, and then move towards the more abstract conceptual ideas. One thing to think about is there anything they need to know first? Is there anything they need to know before you can deliver this content? In which case, are you going to include that? Do they have to do something else first? How are you going to make sure that learning is there already? And then a slightly more complex way of looking at things is what's called spiral sequencing. So if you have, let's say, 3 or 4 core parts to what you're delivering, you would visit those kind of like a circle, but each time you revisit them, you're going to be going maybe from more simple to more complex, from concrete to abstract. So you can follow those climbs, those pathways from simple to complex, chronology, etc., in that spiral. And the other thing to think about in organizing content, and I think it's something within the settlement environment that we can absolutely do, is to always include certain, what I call core themes and competencies. And I think there are many skills, there are many objectives that we're trying to achieve with our settlement clients that can form part of that learning experience, that can form part of all other learning experiences. So if you, for example, an easy example of that is if we're going to use a more learner-focused approach to curriculum, then we know that we're helping our clients develop more self-sufficiency. They're going to take more ownership of learning. They're going to improve their communication skills. They're going to work more collaboratively, work more in teams. So that's definitely something to think about in terms of organizing your content. Once you've got your content and you know how you're going to organize it, we're now going to go on to selecting our learning activities. So how are we actually going to deliver this? And again, there are many different ways of delivering content. It could be subject-centered, and there may be a case for some of it to be that teacher standing at the front of the room, talking at the learners, passing on information. But you might want to say, no, I want my learning experience to be more interactive. I want them to ask lots of questions. I want the learners to work together. Think about, are we going to have them working in small groups? Are we going to ask them to help each other? Do we want to use problem solving as a a learning activity. So the learners would work together to solve a problem. Are we going to ask learners to teach others what they've learned? And that's a really good test of them being able to formulate not just that they've learnt it, but then they can pass it on to others. Do we want to promote dialogue? And I would suggest that all of those things are good things to do. If we can help learners work together, that's a stronger learning experience. The more real world that we make it, the more relevant it's going to be to the learners, and the stronger learning experience it's going to be. So getting learners to actively engage and contribute to their learning is helping us achieve our intended learning outcomes. So, for example, gaining confidence speaking English in public, adjusting to Canadian culture that may be less authoritarian or more collaborative than perhaps they're used to. So definitely the delivery method is something to think about. And then matching that when you're selecting those with three things, really: the characteristics of adult learners, and adult learners do have specific needs, and then our settlement clients, what are the characteristics of those, and then of course most important, taking those but feeding into that your local client profile. So thinking about adult settlement learners, so I've put the adult and the settlement learners together for this. And I don't think there's any real surprises here, but we know that adult learners, they want to be respected. If you're an adult learner, it's, you're being asked to put your trust in somebody, and you're coming to it with a great deal of knowledge and experience, and that needs to be respected. And what they're there to learn shouldn't devalue what they already have. So they want to know, to be comfortable, they want to know what is expected of them. They need to be able to ask questions. They need to receive feedback. And variety is good, and the big thing is that they are very practical. All the people that we work with here, they know I'm living in this culture, I'm living life, I need to know something that is relevant to my specific situation. I need it to fulfill that need. I don't have lots of time to go to school to do this. So they want those things. And at the same time, it's coming. I'm going to continue. So I'm going to talk about what they need. So they need lots of encouragement and positive reinforcement. Thinking about our settlement learners, these are people who we're probably asking to participate in a new learning experience, in a new language. And we really need to just allow them that flexibility, some space as they get used to adapting to language and culture. And we're asking them to understand a whole range of behaviours and skills that will help them to function well within Canadian society. And of course, many of them come with cultural backgrounds. Well, we all come with cultural backgrounds that affect our learning. And depending on the place of origin of your learners, they may have expectations that are just a little different, but they could be very different. And they could come from hierarchical cultures, particularly in the learning environment. There are many cultures where the teacher does stand at the front and just passes on information, and as long as they remember that information and pass it back, then that would be considered successful learning. So it's something to think about. So once we've been through, we've done our needs assessment, we've selected content, we've organised that content, we've looked at our learning activities, the last step in the process is evaluation. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I could spend a lot of time on it. But it's a useful, if you do formalise your curriculum this way and you write down those steps, it's a way that you can keep that process going round. so you can evaluate, and then it gets fed back in to change the curriculum on an ongoing basis. And that's useful for you, but it's also useful for learners, it's useful for funders, it's useful for host organizations. So what I wanted to do now is just take that process and see how it might apply to the settlement environment. And so here we have the curriculum development process, but of course what feeds into that curriculum development process at a local level is those higher aims, if you like. So we're looking at, we have the IRCC logic model, and we have the syllabus. We have settlement topics, which would be knowledge. There are life skills, obviously skills, and then values that are reflected in the community connections piece of what we're trying to deliver. So just quickly to look at that, I just adapted this from the logic model, but you can see that we have immediate outcomes that feed into what we're doing. We have intermediate outcomes, and then we have ultimate outcomes that are giving us those really high-level aims. And then we have what I'm calling the syllabus here. So there are those settlement topics. So that's the knowledge base that we're working with, which is wide-ranging. And we then have obviously life skills and responsibilities, which of citizenship, that's a mix of skills and knowledge, and then essential skills that we're trying to develop. So things like computer skills, document use, interpersonal skills, etc., leadership training. So that's the syllabus that really gives us those, the high-level aims, the topics, the direction that we can then take to start working locally. Obviously, the organization environment feeds into that as well. So your delivery setting is going to come from your local organization, the time available. There are all sorts of other parameters. But basically, the IRCC logic model and syllabus and your organization environment that's the framework in which to then look at the curriculum development process here. So working within that, really the whole curriculum development process then relies on the knowledge of the settlement worker, the people at the face who know what the local client environment is like. You know, the settlement workers, the people working with the clients, are really the people who know what the local needs are, and who can select the content, who can organize it, select the learning activities, and then evaluate the outcomes. So in terms of input, the settlement worker, or the people, as I said, the front face, really it's wide-ranging, and so you're taking those high-level aims and really tailoring things to the local needs. So what are the needs of your local immigrants? What is the local environment? There may be situations or aspects that leap out at you that immigrants who are in that environment need support. What are the language abilities of your local clients? What's their cultural background, their educational background? Are there things happening in life that will help you decide timing? When is it right to do certain workshops, a series of workshops? And are there particular priority outcomes and enabling skills that you we need to be trying to develop as part of settlement support, but particularly locally, are there some things that stand out to you locally as well? So I'm thinking of things like, you know, do we want to develop critical thinking or problem solving? Do we want to build confidence? Do we want to develop cultural awareness and understanding? And what particular parts of that do your people need? Resourcefulness is another one. that you might want to think about so that our clients can become more self-sufficient in their adaptation and integration. So this is really where I'm coming from, and I'm just suggesting that this framework for developing a curriculum in your local environments. So I'm suggesting that in all aspects of delivery that there is a focus on developing those kind of core, appropriate, essential skills and attitudes. So that confidence building, the communication skills, the problem solving, the resourcefulness building, and collaboration and team working. And these are all things that are going to help clients adapt and integrate. And so those become a core, if you like, regardless of your syllabus, regardless of the topics that you're looking at. And so use a learning experience and a learner-centered approach wherever possible, because I do think that involving learners in deciding curriculum content and helping them develop ownership of the learning experience will actually help them adapt to the Canadian environment. These are skills, these are attitudes that we want to, they're outcomes that we're trying to achieve. And so for each knowledge or skill area, you're going to look at core topics for your learners, core content. That key content will be based on the lacks or the needs or the wants for your local environment. You're going to prioritize and decide the timing. When are you going to do things? How long is it going to be? You'll identify materials and adapt. And then you'll build your learning activities around delivery methods, which will focus on these things we've been talking about: learner involvement, encouraging dialogue, ownership of learning, focusing, building them around essential and life skills development, and ensuring that they have maximum relevance and usability for those clients, and then evaluate. So that's the process, if you like, for locally to develop your curriculum. And here's just a graphic, really just hopefully to represent that. And so starting from that core knowledge and skills and content, so that would be something that's needed by all newcomers, which we add on key local content. And so the settlement worker will have assessed those local lacks, needs and wants, prioritize them, timed them. Having done that, you'll select your materials and adapt to the local client environment. So making sure they're relevant, usable, and that you're balancing all those knowledge, skills, and values items. And then, having done that, select your learning activities, focusing on interactive activities, dialogue, helping learners own the whole experience, the curriculum. And all of that within an environment of evaluation. And that's really where I'm going to finish, and I'm sorry I pressed the button. So I'm going to pass over to Lisa of ISSA BC, who's going to do a case study.
Thank you so much, Carol. It was great. You're learning. I'm just still absorbing everything that you've talked about. So thank you so much. And so we're going to say goodbye to Carol for the moment. We're going to have at the very end of the webinar, we're going to have a Q&A session with both Carol and Lisa. But Lisa's now going to be talking about building a presentation, and I will let her introduce herself and share a little bit about the case study that ISSA BC went through.
Thank you, Sabrina. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Lisa. Thank you so much.
That's great. Thanks. So, as Sabrina said, my name is Lisa Herrera, and like Carol, I began my career as an adult ESL teacher. I taught in the LINC program for 15 years, but for the last 8 years, I've been the lead instructional coordinator for the LINC program at ISSA BC, and that's how I'm presenting to you today. So today I'm going to illustrate Carol's information about curriculum development by talking about a presentation the ISSA BC LINC program created last year for the Fire Prevention Officers Association of BC. Oops, okay, and I'm just going to go forward a bit here. So first I'll go through the steps of development that we followed, which Carol spoke of. Then, because the content of our presentation also illustrates what Carol was talking about in terms of presenting to adult newcomers, I will briefly go over what our presentation looked like. So first of all, let me say a little bit about ISSA BC. So ISSA BC is the largest immigrant serving agency in Western Canada with offices across the Lower Mainland. In Vancouver, we currently have 2 sites, Welcome House, which is the reception center for government-assisted refugees on Drake Street downtown, and our head office on Terminal Avenue. We also have offices in Burnaby, New Westminster, Richmond, Coquitlam and Port Coquitlam, Surrey, Maple Ridge, Langley, and Squamish. In just a couple of months, ISSA BC will be opening a new Welcome Center for refugees in Vancouver at Victoria and 10th Avenue, which will also be our new head office. ISSA BC's new Welcome Center is the first facility of its kind in the world. It will not only provide housing for newly arrived refugees, it will also house many of the services that newcomers need. Apart from settlement services, ISSA BC also provides employment and language training services to immigrants and refugees. Consequently, ISSA BC has a lot of experience providing information to immigrants, including immigrants with low levels of English. For those of you who aren't familiar with LINC, it's a federally funded program that teaches real-life English to immigrants and refugees through settlement topics such as health, housing, banking, education, and Canadian culture, and uses the national standard of the Canadian language benchmarks for teaching and assessing at each level. ISSA BC has offered the LINC program for more than 20 years, so we have a lot of experience adapting authentic information and materials for people with various levels of English. As to how this project came about, in September of 2015, ISSA BC was approached by the Fire Prevention Officers Association of BC, who were looking for a speaker for their public education symposium to give tips on better communicating important fire prevention and fire safety information to people who had low levels of English. The Fire Prevention Officers Association of BC is an organization dedicated to the prevention of fire and the reduction of its impact on the population and economy of BC. We were very happy to create a presentation for them because in exchange, they will be presenting on fire safety and fire prevention to some of our LINC classes later this year. So, how did we develop this new presentation for the FPO ABC? I'm just going to use a short form for them. So, as Carol noted, for any presentation, the presenter needs to understand who is going to be in the audience, the context of the presentation, so is it a workshop or an information presentation, how long will it be, those kinds of things, and the content to cover. What kind of knowledge and skills do we expect participants to already have on this topic, and what do they need to learn? For who we were trying to reach, for our presentation, it was the public educators in the FPO ABC. And the context for reaching them was a 1-hour lecture-style presentation at their public education symposium. Of course, identifying the who and the context is usually pretty easy. So it's the content that's the challenge. Just waiting for my slide to change here. Our presentation to the FPO ABC was about presentations, how to make them more effective for adult newcomers with low levels of English. To determine the content of our presentation, we therefore had to ask the FPO ABC the same questions we were asking ourselves. Who were they trying to reach? The context in which they were trying to reach them, and the kind of content they needed to impart in their presentations. This is what we learned from our needs assessment. Now, we only had 1 hour to present, so we wanted to keep the information simple, but still include the most important points to help the FPO ABC with creating more effective presentations. we decided the most important points were helping the FPO-ABC better understand adult newcomers, simplifying oral and written language for adults with low levels of English, and how to make complex information more accessible. So those were our objectives for the presentation. For us, selecting the content and organizing the content somewhat happened together. Listing the FPO-ABC's questions and gaps, what they needed to know, suggested an order for our presentation. Basically, we moved from the simplest information to the most complex. So for example, the FPO-ABC needed some background on newcomers to Canada, so we started with that. Information about diversity, what to expect with different English language levels, and important things to keep in mind, such as the need to be culturally sensitive. Okay, I have a poll here, and I think Sabrina is going to pull up a poll with these two questions.
Yes, I am. We're just going to launch our first poll right now. So I'll wait another couple of seconds while the last votes are coming in, but it looks like it's quite varied. About 3/4 know who is going to be their audience, but approximately 1/3 does not know who their audience is going to be.
Okay. And we'll go to our next question.
So the last couple of votes are coming in, but the answer looks more than 80% have said that they present to a diverse group, where only 20% say that they present to a homogeneous group.
Okay. So if you know you're going to have a homogeneous group, you can adapt your presentation to directly meet their needs, such as by providing translators if you know that they will all speak one first language. So that's something you can do if you know you're going to have a homogeneous group. If you don't know who your audience will be, or if you usually have a diverse group, which it sounds like most of you do, we find it's better to plan for a presentation that can be accessible even to people with low levels of English. That way you can be sure to reach the whole audience. So we found that through talking to the FPO-ABC rep, we found that they usually did presentations in libraries, schools, and other venues where the audience could have a range of English ability. So they often had a diverse audience. So after giving them some background about a newcomer audience, the next logical aspect for us to talk about was the best presentation style for newcomers with low levels of English. So I've got another quick poll here with two questions.
So the last answers are just coming in, but it looks a little over 60% has said that they give presentation styles compared to 36% who give more workshops, hand-on activities.
Okay, and the second question.
So overwhelmingly, over 80% have said yes, they provide handouts as information to take away, where 8% had said yes, they provide print materials only for activities, and another 8% said no, they ask the participants to just take notes.
Okay, great. Okay, Well, we're doing a presentation right now, but for reaching adult newcomers, our experience suggests that a limited agenda using a learner-centered curriculum with hands-on activities is most effective for getting information across. So that's what we communicated to the FPO-ABC. And I think that's what Carol was advocating as well, a mostly learner-centered curriculum with hands-on activities. So of course we only had 1 hour for our presentation and a fair amount of information to convey. So unfortunately we couldn't model the learner-centered curriculum that we were advocating, but we would have preferred to do that. However, what we did do was we gave very concrete examples throughout the presentation to illustrate what we meant. So for example, we provided concrete examples of what simplifying oral and written language actually looks like. We find that if we don't have time for activities, giving concrete examples is the next best thing for making the presentation meaningful and useful. Okay, one last poll here. 2 questions.
So the last votes are coming in, and it's pretty close to each other. Approximately 55% said that they usually give subject-centered presentations, where 45% learner-centered presentations.
Great, and our second question.
So I'm just,
Quite a few.
yeah, quite a few answers are coming in, so
Okay.
we'll just give it another 2-3 seconds. So it looks like 32% of people have said that they discuss questions in pairs or small groups. 18% have said that they hold whole group discussions. 10% said that participants complete exercises. 18% said participants do activities and share the results. And 22% has said that they have a Q&A session.
And I bet some of you were asked to pick just one, but probably some of you do a couple of those. So maybe you do a whole group discussion, but you also do a question and answer session, or you do some exercises, but you also have some questions in small groups. So as I said, we generally recommend a learner-centered approach with hands-on activities when presenting, both to newcomers and to mainstream audiences actually. But for the FPO-ABC, because of the time we had, we used a subject-centered presentation with concrete examples and questions to the audience rather than activities, so kind of like what I'm doing with you today. And this is often how we adapt if we have time constraints for presenting. If we have more time, we definitely prefer to work in hands-on activities. So that about wraps up how we went about developing a new presentation in terms of doing a needs assessment, selecting and organizing the content, and choosing learning experiences. And now, because the content of the presentation we created for the FPO-ABC reinforces what Carol presented about adult settlement learners, I'll just very briefly go over what our presentation ended up looking like. So because our audience needed some background on newcomers, we provided some information about newcomers' diversity, about what to expect in terms of comprehension at different English language level, because that affects how quickly you speak and how much information you can give, and other factors to be aware of when presenting to adult newcomers. And although, of course, in the Lower Mainland, lots of people have experience presenting to newcomers, it doesn't hurt to remind people about things like being culturally sensitive. So then we moved on to presentation style. And here is where we suggested the learner-centered curriculum with interactions and visuals. Visuals are really important when you've got people with low levels of English to support meaning. So to support this, we gave concrete examples of simplifying the agenda and including learning activities. We did this by showing a fairly packed agenda that you see on the left, and then an agenda with fewer topics and learning activities for each topic, which you can see circled in red. If this were a workshop for the FPO ABC, we would have included a learning activity ourselves at this point. So for example, like our model, we might have given participants examples of dense agendas and asked them to simplify to 3 points and to include some suggestions for learning activities. As language was a key issue for the FPO-ABC, we then talked about how specifically to make adjustments to language to better reach adults with low levels of English. Again, if this were a workshop, we would have provided a learning activity here. Perhaps we would have given the participants some abstract fire safety concepts and asked them to make them more concrete, or maybe some complex sentences about fire prevention and ask them to simplify. We then provided a concrete example of what simplifying spoken language sounds like by reading them 2 different introductions, one with lots of unnecessary language and one that was very simple, spoken at a slower pace, and very much to the point. And the one that you see on the left is one that we all do naturally, and it's got a lot of extra words in there that people don't really need, and the one on the right is one that is just more to the point. So we also gave a concrete example of simplifying written language. Just waiting for my slide here because it's got a picture. Here we go. So this top picture is an example of some information about Syrian refugees that we recently wanted to communicate to our LINC classes. And the bottom is the handout that we turned it into for our lower level classes with fewer words, some key points, and including visuals for meaning. And even though we did this for our low level classes, there's no reason that it can't be used for people with higher levels of English because it just goes straight to the point and gets the meaning across. Now again, if we had time for hands-on activities with our presentation, we would have had participants perhaps practice speaking simply, perhaps by pairing them up and asking one to speak while the other goes over a checklist to evaluate the simplicity of their speech. We also could have practiced simplifying written language by giving them handouts, probably the handouts that they actually use in their own presentations in the past, and get them to suggest pictures they could add and simple sentences that they could use to convey the key points. Finally, we usually provide a summary. We find giving a summary of what was covered at the end of the presentation is very helpful and gives a chance for participants to sort of process a bit and to remember their questions for the question and answer session that we have at the end. And I just want to note that we sometimes do a formal evaluation for presentations, usually with a questionnaire. For this presentation, however, we just got feedback from participants who spoke to us afterwards. And so that was the process we used and the actual presentation that resulted. And I hope you found it useful for understanding how to develop presentations for adult newcomers yourselves. And I'll turn it back over to Sabrina.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for sharing how the process that you and your team went through in delivering the workshop. So we're now at the time of our webinar where we have an opportunity for you to ask questions to our speakers, to both Carol and to Lisa. So some of the questions are coming in. There's different ways how you can submit your questions. So please feel free to either tweet us your question using AMSSA events, email your questions to events@amssa.org, or to type in your questions to the question box that's on the GoToWebinar panel. So the first question that has come in is, how is planning the curriculum for a one-off workshop different than planning a longer-term course or program? So I don't know, Carol, if you would like to answer this one, or Lisa, if you would like to take an approach to this one.
Perhaps Carol can start.
I can start and then I'll hand over. I think in essence, It isn't any different. Obviously, if you're planning a series, then you might want to go into a lot more depth, take more time, but essentially you're going to go through the same steps. You still need to look at the needs of your learners. You know, what is the core content, what's useful for them, select that content, organize it. It's essentially the same process. Just perhaps the level of detail might be a little bit different. I don't know what Lisa has to say about that one.
No, I agree. I think that the things that, some practical things that we do if we have more than one session is that we have the opportunity to build in a bit of review at the beginning of another session, a follow-up session. The other thing is that we also then have the opportunity to maybe ask the participants to bring in some personal information. So in the first presentation, they're just relying on what they remember while they're sitting there, but we might be able to ask them, for instance, to bring back something that they've tried out, or some questions that they have, or some information about themselves for the second session, so we can tailor it a bit more.
Just to add to that, I absolutely agree. From years of ESL teaching, you can never review enough. It's so valuable to go back and just revisit before you start adding on for another session. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Another question that came in is, where can I get more ideas for activities and other interactive approaches to make my workshops and classes more learner-centered?
Well, from my end, there's some great curriculum packages. AMSSA has one on your website that is I forget what it was called, Act Now. I think it was called Act Now, and it's about health. And so it's a fully developed curriculum for, I think, CLB 1 to 4. I can't quite remember the levels of English, but it just gives some ideas. You probably aren't going to use that exact information, but it gives some great ideas for activities that you can do in a workshop to help learners work with information.
Yeah, I would also say, very often if you are going to go out, for example, if you're thinking about financial literacy, we use some materials from the, I always get the name wrong, the Canadian Centre for Financial Literacy, which includes, it comes as a package, and that includes some really good activities, and the materials are really good. They're very easy to go through and then look at what is appropriate to add, adapt, take in, put in, take out. So if there are organizations, and the financial organizations are always good for that, there are often packages like that available. So I'd probably start with trying to contact somebody in that area, some organization that is actually educating in that area. And then they often have those activities, and then it's a case of really often overlaying your adult immigrant settlement client situation onto that to adapt.
Okay, thank you so much. Another question that has come in is, what is the difference between an instructor and a facilitator when it comes to workshops or short-term courses? How can this difference be addressed in the curriculum planning process?
I'll take that one first. To my mind, the difference is between essentially being subject-centered and being learner-centered. And so in subject-centered, you're an instructor passing information on. If you focus on the learners more, you're basically trying to facilitate their learning, and so you're trying to present them with activities, experiences that are working for them, that are going to help them learn. In a nutshell, I think.
Yeah, I agree, and often when you're facilitating, you have to stand back a little bit and let the learners discover some information for themselves, which can be hard if you know the answer and you want to rush in and give it to them, but facilitating it, being learner-centered, lets the learners do a little bit of discovery.
don't put the hands on the computer terminal. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. Another question that has come is a lot of times we invite guest speakers to come in and present to clients at our workshops. How can we communicate these adult learner guidelines to them as well?
Yeah, good point. I'm going to let Lisa answer that one.
That's a really good question, and it's something that we work really hard on. So usually when we're contacting the speaker, we ask them if we can have a little bit of time to talk to them about who their audience is going to be, to help them reach their audience a bit better. And most times I find that the speaker wants to reach their audience, wants to impart their, make sure that their information is well received. And so they'll give us a little bit of time to go over that, to go over some of these principles with them. If they can, and if they have the time, we actually like to bring them somewhere where they can actually see the kinds of the people that they're going to present to, and especially for us, the level of language that they have, and that really helps a lot in terms of them being able to make their own adjustments. Sometimes they don't have time, but if they do have time to go over these things a little bit beforehand, it really makes a big difference, we find, in the presentations that they give.
Mm-hmm. And I think by most speakers, when they come and they say, can you, I need, what are the needs, what do you want to cover, then you've got the door open to have that conversation immediately. Whether it's how much depth you do it in, will depend on how much time they have. But usually I think speakers, they say, who is it I'm speaking? They're doing their own needs assessment. And so we can just help facilitate that whole process for them.
Okay, thank you so much. And a follow-up question to that one that came in is, have you developed some type of handout or guideline that you give external presenters prior to those meetings, or do you have those first conversations with them when you meet prior to the workshop?
For me, we have not developed a handout, primarily because I find that just giving a handout doesn't usually communicate well enough the points or the principles that I'm trying to get across. I find just a conversation on the phone when I'm arranging the speaking, the speaker to come, is usually the most effective. I have sent emails to people if I can't spend time with them on the phone to give them some key points, but I always find it's more effective if I can just talk them through it.
Yes, I would agree. We don't have guidelines to ditto. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Another question that has come in is, building a rapport with learners important for achieving the learning outcomes, and how can we best make our learners feel comfortable in our sessions?
Yes, absolutely. Building rapport is extremely important. I think this is all to do with really understanding where adult learners are coming from, and really then adding on to that a settlement client, so that situation. If you are asking an adult to go, and usually it's back a number of years into a learning situation, that can be quite intimidating, and that can be, this is where, what's expected of me? What are we going to do? I don't want to look stupid. So adults, children are often happy to put themselves in the hands of their teacher. Adults, not so much. They may be very wary of situations that they don't understand. They don't want to look stupid or feel stupid. They want to make sure that they understand what's expected of them. It's very important to have that conversation with them, and to be clear what the purpose is, why they're there, what we're trying to do, the fact that they will be respected. Listen to them, listen to what they want, so building that trust is absolutely key to doing that. And really the way to do that is dialogue, if not before the session, it's certainly within the session, and so that's something that can be built in to things. And I've forgotten the second part of the question.
I would just follow up to what you were going to say, Carol, or sorry, what you had just said in terms of at the beginning of the session, asking if there are any burning questions, if there are any questions that they're bringing. So, I mean, although you know something about your audience before you come, sometimes getting those questions out right at the very beginning, and then allowing the audience to see that you're going to incorporate that information directly in your presentation. So you'll focus on that. You'll make sure that those questions get answered, helps them to trust that you are actually going to lead them into useful information.
Thank you so much. And I think that the second part of the question was, how can we best make our learners feel comfortable in our sessions? I think they're asking for maybe some tips or some best practice approaches that you can take to really help clients feel comfortable in various workshop settings.
I think it's exactly what we've just been saying, is to listen, to make them understand that their needs and requirements are being listened to, and they'll be incorporated, and really being aware of their situation, not putting them in any situations that are going to make them feel uncomfortable. I think you have to be very aware of what's happening in the room and watch what's happening in the room. We can't assume that anybody is familiar perhaps with some of the things that we're doing in the room, and I, for one, always explain adults, the only thing that adult learners can't do is speak English as well as us. And so I explain, you know, what are we doing, why are we doing it, and to me that respects that relationship and establishes that, hopefully starts to establish that kind of trust and understanding.
And I would add that, you know, as you're reading that room, there's always going to be people who are more outspoken and people who are more quiet. And I think giving, you know, allowing those people who have things to say, some space to say it, but also giving some quiet space and maybe directing some opportunity for the quieter peoples to be able to speak is a great way of sort of including everybody in the room in the presentation, and as well really sort of listening carefully to the input that they do give and acknowledging it. So if they've told you something about, you know, some of the information that you're giving, reflecting that back to them, and even, you know, working it in, showing them how it works as an example or things like that, so that they feel that the input that they're giving is valued.
One other thing that you might want to think about is if people are holding back, often trying to get feedback to the full group can be very intimidating, and that might be a situation. So working with groups, with pairs, is often a good way to bring those people, just make them feel that they can express it in some way.
And you know, learning activities, if you have some that are, let's say, you know, you've got some that are discussion, but maybe some where they're jotting some notes or something, so that people who learn differently or maybe express themselves differently have an opportunity to do that in the session, so that not everybody has to stand up and speak if that's not their strength, but they can still give some input in ways that they feel comfortable.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Another question that came in was in regards to the best approach for advertising various different workshops, and when do you take the advertising material into account in your curriculum development stage, and what do you do, the second part of the question is, what do you do if you don't get enough participants for a particular workshop? Do you adapt the curriculum for smaller groups? How do you go about doing that?
Can I take the second question first? I think, and this is certainly something that we've had in Whistler, is you don't always get, you know, you plan a workshop and you put it out there and people don't come, or maybe one or two people come. And so the question is to go back and say, why is that happening? And there's a lot of reasons why that might be happening. It might be the timing. I think it might be the location. So it could be some practical reasons. It could also be that that topic is for some reason not engaging people. So it might be something that we know is important, but as I said, immigrants often don't know what the questions are. And so we might have to think about how we're trying to engage these people, how we're trying to bring them in. So that's one thing. We've also would look at alternative ways to perhaps deliver that material. And that's something that certainly we're working on at the moment in Worcester and Pemberton. We have a population that is they're working, most people working 2 jobs all over the place, schedules change. So it's snowing right now, so it's going to be busy the end of this week and this weekend, so people are going to find it difficult to come to things because they'll be asked to work. These are all things that we're trying to struggle with. And definitely we found that the way that we present it and the way that we engage it is very important. And it might be that the core message or the core workshop you're trying to deliver has to be embedded in something else. Do you want to talk about that, Lisa?
Well, I can say that I know for us sometimes when we're trying to advertise some kind of presentation, sometimes we use the words that mean something to us but don't necessarily mean something to our learners. So for instance, if we advertise a financial literacy workshop to the people, to the participants, they might think, well, I don't need financial literacy. But if we can advertise it, making it really clear what they're going to take away from it, you know, then I find that it gives a little bit more interest, and people see how it's worth their time to come out to something like that. And then just in terms of the other question of adapting to, of if you only have a smaller audience, again, I think if you have a learner-centered presentation, you can do that with any size audience. You know, as long as you've got 2 people, you can do a presentation if it's learner-centered. If you're just trying to do a stand-up presentation and only 2 people come, that can feel kind of weird. If you're just, just standing and talking. But if they're doing activities, even if it's 2 people, you can go ahead and do that. So that's why I think it's valuable to sort of start from that perspective.
And it almost, it's a value judgment as to how many people we need. We did have one occasion where 1 person came out. But interesting, at the end of the session, apparently that person said this was the best day of my life. So for that person, what happened in that room on that day, which was obviously highly individualized, was amazing for them.
That's great.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much for sharing that one, Carol. So another question that has come in is, do you have any tips in terms of cultural sensitivity and awareness in curriculum development? How can we incorporate sensitivity and awareness into these activities? And the example was brought in, for example, in the context of creating workshops for refugees or very specific marginalized client groups.
Well, I think it goes back to knowing your target group, and question I would ask back to that person is, are you trying to deliver to those groups within a wider population, or are we trying to target those populations specifically? I think that would change what I'd be looking at, and change my needs assessment in a significant way.
Yeah, I agree that it's a little difficult to answer that question. One thing about sensitivity is being aware how even simple questions could trigger memories, possibly trauma in people if they've experienced trauma. So if you've got a diverse audience and you suspect that some people might be refugees, that's something to sort of keep in mind. You can ask a very simple question. I'm trying to think of a simple question, but you could ask a very simple question, and it, reminds someone of something that happened to them before they came to Canada, and causes them to have a bad experience. So I'm not quite too sure how to answer that. As Carol said, if you're speaking directly to a group of refugees, I think it would be very different than if you're speaking to a diverse group that includes refugees and marginalized populations.
Okay, yeah, thank you for sharing that. And if the person who did answer or who did ask that question, if they would like to elaborate and follow up, I'll keep my eye open for that one and ask it if the question comes. But we do have a couple of questions that have come in regards to evaluation. And one is, if you're running a series of workshops, would you suggest evaluation at the end of each day or at the end of the series? Would you suggest paper or electronic evaluations?
Wow.
Well, if it's a series, I find getting a little bit of evaluation at the beginning to help me tailor the rest of the series is useful. I personally wouldn't give an evaluation after every session because I find people start to not give really good information if you ask them over and over again. So sort of at the beginning, just to get some information to tailor it, and then at the end so that I can get some feedback on how the whole thing went. And in terms of paper, if you're doing it, what we find is that if we give a paper evaluation and we give time within the presentation for people to fill it out, then we'll get quite a lot of people filling it out. If we wait for an electronic one, although it's much easier to get the information, to collate the information afterwards, we get less people responding to that. So I guess it sort of depends on how much time you have to take a whole bunch of papers and collate that into information at the end.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think one nice way to do it is, as Lisa says, I would spend time at the beginning. I wouldn't do it every session, but I might spend time at the beginning to get some input on what their expectations and their expected outcomes are of the series. And that means that you can then go back at the end and you can tie in the evaluation at the end to did they achieve what they wanted to achieve? And I would say paper. The minute that you go electronic, I think you lose the numbers of responses, and I think you also perhaps lose some of the immediacy of the feedback. So again, yes, exactly as Lisa says, I would include it. I would include the evaluation as part of the workshops or the series, the program. I think it's an important part of the program, and I wouldn't put it outside of that that delivery.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And yes, evaluations are key elements, and we have also developed an evaluation form which we will be sending out electronically following this webinar as well. Another question that has come in is in regards to templates that may exist for settlement workers to use in creating curriculum and hosting workshops. Have you come across any specific templates that exist that people can use, or did you start each of your workshops from scratch in the creation process?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I know at ISS of BC that we have, just because we've been doing it for so long, there's a number of templates that are already in existence, but those are just within ISS of BC. I don't know if AMSSA has a place for anything like that. I think that's probably the place to share those kinds of things.
Yes, I think it's a mixture of what's already within the organization and then continuously adapting that to the situation at hand. I wouldn't know of anywhere else personally that you could find that.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much. And if somebody, or if an organization does have a template that they would like to share, please feel free to send it to AMSSA and we can circulate it to everyone. And another question that came in was in regards to guest speakers. Using the example that you presented, Carol, in terms of financial literacy, do you find it better to bring in a guest speaker who are experts on the topic but may not be experienced in presenting to newcomers, or would you suggest that the settlement worker create the content themselves, even though they may lack the expertise when it comes to financial literacy?
Really good question. I have a multi kind of answer to that. I think that if you're going to invite somebody in, I think you need to review the content and the materials quite closely. I think that many financial literacy materials that they're geared towards Canadians definitely need adaptation for immigrants. And so the materials that we use, which as I say was through the CCFL, we worked with the CCFL on adapting those materials to immigrants. And so we take a focus on things that tend to impact them a lot more. To be honest, a lot of immigrants really manage their money really, really well. And their issues come from things like they manage it so well that they have no credit rating, so that when they get there, they can't get credit. So it's an awareness job, and I think many of the financial institutions that come in are not looking specifically at the immigrant situation. So what we do is we adapt, we use materials that we use ourselves, we ask speakers to come in to talk about specific things. So we might ask them to come in and talk specifically about a TFSA or RRSPs. We also have an immigrant, a lady who is, we helped through her process of opening her business as a bookkeeper. And she actually explains it so well for other immigrants that we ask her to come in and present, so that somebody with direct experience and knowledge, and so we kind of approach it on that kind of multi-pronged way. Don't know if that answers the question.
I think it does, Carol, and I just wanted to say we've come to the end of the time of our time together, and I just wanted to say thank you so much to both you, Carol, and to Lisa for presenting and sharing and giving a lot of very practical examples and sharing what you do in your own work and experience. So, and also thank you to everyone for submitting questions and for joining us for today's webinar. We will be emailing an evaluation form to everyone, so please take the time to fill out the evaluation, as AMSSA really relies on the feedback provided in the evaluations to plan future events and trainings. As well, we've received numerous requests to send out the handout again, which we will be sending. As well, we will be sending out a copy of the slides to everyone, so you'll be receiving both. Special thank you again to Lisa and Carol for giving us your time and expertise and really supporting the settlement sector in creating those fundamental and learner-centered workshops. I'd also like to thank the AMSSA team here, Melissa, Bahar, Trisha, and Lucy for helping to assist to put on today's webinar. As well, I'd like to thank Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada for funding this event. The webinar was recorded and it will be posted along with the handout and the PowerPoint slides on the AMSSA website, and we will be sending out a notification on SetNet once everything is online. If you do not receive the weekly update for SetNet, please log on to our website and sign up. It's free for everyone to join, and you will receive a weekly email every Tuesday with various informations related to settlement and integration. And we also have some information on the back of our handout on how to sign up for SetNet and the link there. So thank you to everyone so much for joining today. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.